Okay, The Courage of the Truth, lectures by Michel Foucault, given at the College of France, 1983-84. Lecture 3. Given on February 8, 1984, the first hour. So this will be lecture 2, given on February 8, 1984, the first hour. I would like to take up this problem of parasia from where I left it last year and try to present a somewhat simplified account of what I think was an important transformation in this history of parasia. That is to say, the transition from a practice, right, obligation, and duty of veridiction defined in relation to the city, its institutions, and the status of the citizen, to a different type of veridiction, a different type of parasia, which will be defined not in relation to the city, the polis, but to individuals' ways of doing things, being, and conducting themselves, ethos, and also to their formation as moral subjects. And through this transformation of a parasia oriented towards and correlative to the polis, into a parasia oriented towards and correlative to ethos. I would like to show you today how Western philosophy, at least in some of its fundamental features, may have been constituted as a form of practice of true discourse. First, a brief reminder, forgive me, this is schematic and repetitive for those who were here last year, but may be indispensable in order to clarify things and reactualize the problem. You recall, last year we considered parasia in the political field and in the framework of democratic institutions. The word parasia is attested for the first time in the text of Euripides, in which it referred to the right to speak, the right to take the floor and speak publicly, and to have one's say, as it were, in order to express one's views in the realm of matters of interest to the city. The word parasia designates the right to have one's say in the city's affairs. The several of Euripides' texts enabled us to see, first, that this parasia, this right to have one's say, is not a right if one is not a citizen by birth. You recall that Ion did not want to return to Athens in the guise of the son of a father who was not a citizen of Athens and of an unknown mother. He wanted to be able to exercise his parrhesia as a birthright. Second, we also saw that one does not have this right of parrhesia when one is exiled in a foreign city. You remember the dialogue between Iocasta and Polynice in the Phoenician Women. Iocasta meets Polynice returning from exile and asks him, "But what is exile? Is it something so hard?" And Polynice replies, "Certainly. It is the hardest thing to bear, because in exile one does not have parrhesia. One does not have the right to speak. And so one finds oneself the slave, doulos, of the masters, and one cannot even oppose their madness." Finally, third, we saw that even when one is a citizen, living in one's own city, and possessing parrhesia as a birthright, one may lose this right if one's family is in some way marked by a stain, dishonor, or shame. This is Hippolytus when Phaedra confesses her love and fears that her own confessed wrongdoing will deprive her children, her sons, of parrhesia. So parrhesia appeared in these texts as a right and as a privilege which was part of the well-born, honorable citizen's existence, giving him access to political life, understood as the possibility of giving one's view and thereby contributing to collective decisions. Parrhesia was a right to be preserved at any price, a right to be exercised to the fullest possible extent, and one of the forms in which the free existence of a free citizen manifested itself, taking the word free in its full and positive sense. That is to say, a freedom which gives one the right to exercise one's privileges in the midst of others, in relation to others, and over others. Now, and this was the direction we were following when we stopped last year, in later text, parrhesia appeared in a somewhat different light. In the mainly philosophical and political texts at the end of the 4th and the beginning of the 5th century, parrhesia appears much less as a right to be exercised in full freedom than as a dangerous practice with ambiguous effects, and a right which is not to be exercised without caution or limits. From Plato to Demosthenes, and including Isocrates, we saw the development of this mistrust of parrhesia, this crisis of parrhesia, as it appears in the philosophical and political literature of the 4th century, and with which I would like to begin to structure this year's lectures, can be characterized by two major phenomena. First, the criticism of democratic parrhesia. Here I would like to try to show you how this criticism was carried out, how and why the possibility of democratic institutions allowing space for truth-telling came to be questioned in Greek philosophical and political thought from Plato to Aristotle. And if the democratic institutions are unable to make room for truth-telling and get parrhesia to function as it should, it is because these democratic institutions lack something. And I will try to show you that this something is what could be called ethical differentiation. Let's be a bit more precise and exact. In the criticism of democratic parrhesia that we see developing in philosophical and political texts of the 4th century, what is at issue is really the criticism of the traditional pretensions of democracy, of democratic institutions and the practices of democracy. Claims such as are represented, elusively at least, in Euripides, to be the privileged site for the emergence of truth-telling. Athens, as a democratic city-state proud of its institutions, claimed to be the city in which the right to speak, to give one's views, to tell the truth, and the possibility of accepting the courage of this truth-telling were actually better realized than elsewhere. This claim of democracy in general, and of Athenian democracy in particular, is challenged. Values seem to be overturned, and democracy appears instead as the place where parrhesia, truth-telling, the right to express one's opinion, and the courage to go against the opinions of others, increasingly becomes impossible, or at any rate, dangerous. This criticism of the claim of democratic institutions to be the site of parrhesia has two aspects. First, in democracy, parrhesia is dangerous for the city. It is dangerous for the city because it is the freedom of everyone and anyone to give their views. In democracy, indeed, the freedom to give one's views is not exercised as the statutory privilege of those whose birth, status, and position give them the ability to tell the truth and speak usefully in the city. In democracy, parrhesia gives scope for everyone to express their opinion and say what is in accord with their private will and with what will enable them to satisfy their interests or passions. Consequently, democracy is not the place where parrhesia will be exercised as a privileged duty, but the place where parrhesia will be exercised as the freedom for everybody and anybody to say anything, that is to say whatever they like. You recall that this is how, in the Republic, Book 8, Plato evokes the motley and diverse city in which everyone gives their opinion, follows their own decisions, and governs himself as he likes. In this city, there are as many politiae, constitutions, governments, as there are individuals. Similarly, at the beginning of On the Peace, paragraph 13, Socrates mentions the orators who the Athenians like to listen to. Who are these people who get up, speak, give their opinion, and are listened to? Well, they are drunks, people who have lost their sense, to nun uk ekontas, those who are not reasonable, and those who share out public wealth and money between themselves. Thus, in this Parrhesiastic freedom, understood as freedom of speech, given to everybody and anybody, to both good and bad orators, to those pursuing their own interest as well as those devoted to the city, true and false discourses, useful as well as bad or harmful opinions, all become mixed up and intermingled in the game of democracy. So we see that in democracy, Parrhesia is dangerous for the city. This was the first aspect. You remember that we found several of these texts. The second worrying aspect concerning democratic Parrhesia, or democracy as the supposedly privileged place for Parrhesia, is that in democracy, Parrhesia is not only dangerous for the city itself, but also for the individual who attempts to exercise it. In this case, a different aspect of Parrhesia is considered. With the first danger, Parrhesia proved to be the freedom granted to everybody to say anything. Now, Parrhesia appears dangerous, inasmuch as it calls for courage on the part of whoever wishes to employ it in a democracy, a courage which may not be respected. In the hubbub of all the orators arguing with each other and trying to seduce the people and seize control of the helm, this is the image of the ship Plato gives in Book 6 of the Republic. Who will be listened to, approved, followed, and loved? It will be those who please the people, say what they want to hear, and flatter them. The others, those who say or try to say what is true and good, and not what pleases the people, will not be listened to. Worse, they will provoke negative reactions, irritation, and anger. And their true discourse will expose them to vengeance or punishment. You recall that in a precise passage in the Apology, Socrates refers to this danger for the individual speaking the truth in the democratic space. After having explained the mission entrusted to him by the god, which consisted in cross-examining different citizens, one after another, stopping them in the street or calling on them in their workplaces and homes, Socrates puts the following objection to himself. Since I claim to be so useful to the city, why then have I not taken part in public life? Why have I never mounted the platform to state my opinion, express my views, and give advice to the city in general? And he replies, if long ago I had devoted myself to politics, I would have lost my life long ago. Do not get angry, he says to his judges, when you hear me tell you these truths. No man can escape death if, however nobly, for noble reasons, he should oppose you or any other popular assembly and endeavor to prevent injustice and illegality in his city. Consequently, a man who speaks for noble reasons and, for these noble reasons, opposes the will of all, Socrates says, risks death. The problem arises. We will come back to it either today or next week. Why did Socrates, who did not fear exposing himself to the risk of death in the name of a particular practice of parrhesia, which he did not want to relinquish, nevertheless refuse to practice political and democratic parrhesia before the assembly? But this is another question. Anyway, the danger of parrhesia as truth-telling in democratic practice is clearly pointed out here, not as a danger for the city in general, but for the individual who, for noble reasons, wishes to oppose the will of the others. Socrates evokes the same kind of danger at the beginning of On the Peace, which I just referred to, when he says, for example, I see that you do not give an equal hearing to the speakers, that you pay attention to some, while you cannot stand even the voice of others. Moreover, it is not at all surprising that you act in this way, for your custom is always to throw out speakers who do not agree with your desires. I know Socrates concludes that it is dangerous to oppose your views, because although we live in a democracy, there is no parrhesia. So you see the notion of parrhesia splitting. On one side, it appears as the dangerous latitude given to everyone and anyone to say everything and anything. And then there is the good, courageous parrhesia of someone who nobly tells the truth, even when the truth is disagreeable. And this parrhesia is dangerous for the individual who employs it. And there is no place for it in democracy. Either democracy makes room for parrhesia, in which case it can be only a freedom which is dangerous for the city, or parrhesia is a courageous attitude, which consists in undertaking to tell the truth, in which case it has no place in democracy. you also find many references to this crisis, this criticism, this denunciation of the inability of democracy to make room for the good parrhesia in many of Demosthenes' discourses. For those who are interested, I refer you to the third Olympiac, for example, where he begins by making a serious accusation against his fellow citizens. You have been reduced to slavery, and think yourselves happy because you are given money for entertainments. And after having uttered this, which is, of course, wounding for those to whom it is addressed, after telling this courageous truth, he immediately adds, "But I know that after speaking to you in this way, and having told you that you are people satisfied with the money given you for entertainments, I would not be surprised if these words that I have just uttered were to cost me more than it costs those, the bad orators, for the harm they have done you. You do not tolerate frankness, speaking out freely. Parrhesia, says the text, on every subject. And what surprises me is that you have let me speak today. A sort of parrhesiastic game unfolds here, which is fairly common in Demosthenes and the orators of this time, in which one attempts to force the listener to accept a truth which hurts him, in which one forces the people of Athens to agree to hearing it being said. You are a people who are satisfied with the money given to you for entertainments. One forces them to accept this hurtful truth by wounding them a second time with a further reproach. This new reproach consists in saying, in any case, you are not capable of accepting the truth. In the first place, you take money for entertainments and are satisfied with it. Secondly, I know the risk I am taking in telling you this, and you will very likely punish me for having done so. It is a sort of challenge blackmail, so that room can be made for that true discourse. A century after Euripides' true discourse in democracy no longer appears as a privilege possessed by those who meet certain conditions. True discourse can only take place through an operation of challenge blackmail. I'm going to tell you the truth, and you are likely to punish me. But if I tell you in advance that you are likely to punish me, this will probably stop you from punishing me and enable me to tell the truth. You find the same mechanism at the beginning of the third Philippic, when Demosthenes refers to the uncontrolled distribution of the right to speak and the unlimited granting of this right in Athenian institutions. He emphasizes the pleasure with which the people listen to those who flatter them. He recalls the disappearance of Parasia as truth-telling, as a consequence, an effect of these institutions and the indulgence of flattery, and he stresses the risks he is taking in speaking as he does. Again, he starts on this challenge blackmail, where he says, either you give up listening only to flatterers and agree to listen to true parasia, or else I will say nothing. There is this passage in the third Philippic. If I frankly tell you some truths, Athenians, I do not think you have cause to get angry. Think about it for a moment. On every other matter, you want free-spokenness, parasia, to be everyone's right in your city. You even grant it to foreigners, and, what is more, to slaves. And, in fact, there are many more servants among you who say whatever they want more freely than citizens in other cities. Here, then, is parasia in Athenian democracy. Everybody, even servants and slaves, can speak freely. But you have driven parasia, free-spokenness, in its positive sense, as courage to speak the truth from the platform. When there is parasia as freedom for everyone, there cannot be parasia as courage to speak the truth. And what is the result of this? Well, says Demosthenes, the result is that in the assemblies you take delight in hearing yourself flattered by speeches which aim only to please you. But then your very safety is endangered by subsequent events. And this is the challenge, blackmail, that is how you feel now. I have nothing more to say to you. And all I can do is remain silent. If, on the other hand, you really want to listen to me and not punish me for the truth I am going to tell you, if you really want to listen to what requires your attention without demanding to be flattered, then I am ready to speak. This, then, is how the criticism of democratic parasia, or rather this pointing out of a sort of impossibility of making a full and positive use of paresia in democratic institutions is expressed. But then, we may ask, what is the reason given for the failure of true discourse to prevail over false discourse in the democratic game? After all, how is it that a courageous speaker who tells the truth cannot get himself recognized? Or again, how is it that people are unable to hear, to listen to, and recognize the speaker who tells the truth? For what reason? Why and how is it not possible to distinguish between true and false discourse in democracy? I think that there is a fundamental problem here which we should try to grasp. What makes true discourse powerless in democracy? Is true discourse powerless in itself? Certainly not. There is, as it were, a contextual powerlessness. True discourse is powerless due to the institutional framework in which it emerges and tries to assert its truth. The powerlessness of true discourse in democracy is obviously not due to the true discourse, to the fact that the discourse is true. It is due to the very structure of democracy. Why will democracy not allow this triad of true and false discourse? Because in a democracy, one cannot distinguish between good and bad speakers, between discourse, which speaks the truth and is useful to the city, and discourse, which utterly lies, flatters, and is harmful. The theme that democracy cannot be the place of true discourse pervades this criticism that we see throughout the 4th century. And in order to recapture something of the central argument from which all these criticisms will spring, I think we can refer to what is, in a sense, its crudest, simplest, most schematic, forthright, and blunt, but also most revealing formulation. The principle that there cannot be any division between true and false discourse in democracy is expressed in a text which was for a long time attributed to Xenophon, but which actually comes from another source and was doubtless written at the turn of the 5th and 4th centuries. The text is called Constitution of the Athenians. It is, in fact, a pamphlet obviously of aristocratic origin, which appears in the slightly twisted form of a paradoxical, false eulogy of Athenian democracy, an ironic hymn in its honor, which turns, of course, into harsh criticism. Under the pretext of highlighting all the merits of Athenian democracy, the author puts forward such derisory reasons, such dreadful motives in support of these merits, that the eulogy is immediately recognized as a fundamental, radical criticism of Athenian institutions. All these modulations around the form of the eulogy were frequent in Greek literature of the 4th century. In this paradoxical, critical, and farcical eulogy of Athenian democracy, there are some lines which are devoted precisely to Parrhesia. They are in the 1st chapter. In this passage, the author of the Constitution of the Athenians refers to certain cities where, he says, it is the most skillful, we would say, the most competent, who make the laws. Also, he says, in these cities it is the good citizens who chastise, keep a tight rein on, repress, and impose the necessary punishment on bad citizens. Finally, he says, in these cities it is the decent people who deliberate and take decisions. And instead of giving the insane, the mad, those who are not in their right mind, the right to speak, they are prevented from bullying, from taking part in the deliberative and decision-making bodies which determine the city's policy. These people who are not in their right mind, the mad, the insane, are not allowed to take part in the deliberations of decision-making bodies, or to give their views, and they have no voting rights. But that's not all. Not only are these people denied access to the boule, the council, in these cities, they are not even allowed to speak. And not only are they not allowed to speak, they are not even allowed to come to the ecclesia, the assembly. They do not have a place at the assembly or the right to speak. So, a fortiori, they have no right to give their views in the councils. And, the author says, with all these precautions, eunomia, the good constitution, the good regime, prevails in these cities. After defining the good regime in this way, that is to say, after having dealt with himself some winning cards, the author of the feigned, ironic, paradoxical, and farcical eulogy of Athenian institutions goes on to say, the great merit of Athens is precisely that of not having given itself this luxury of eunomia, and not having taken these precautions which prevent the mad from taking part in the council, from speaking, and even from coming to the assembly. Athens' great merit, he says, is that of avoiding this eunomia and not having accepted such restrictions. Why has Athens not accepted this regime of restricted speech? The good system of government and the good constitution. These are the reasons he gives, and again you will see that the argument is interesting despite their crude, sophistical, twisted character. It is for the following reason, he says. What happens in a city where only the best have the right to speak and are the ones to voice their opinions and make decisions? The best, precisely because they are the best, try to come to decisions in line with the city's good, interest, and utility. Now, what is good and useful for the city is at the same time, by definition, what is good, useful, and advantageous for the city's best. So that, by encouraging the city to take decisions which are useful for it, they are only serving their own interests, the selfish interest of those who are the best. Now, what happens in democracy? In a true democracy like Athens, you have a regime in which decisions are not taken by the best, but by the many. And what do they seek? Not to submit to anything. In a democracy, the many want above all to be free, not to be slaves, not to serve. What don't they want to serve? They do not want to serve the interests of the city any more than they want to serve the interests of the best. They want to command by themselves. They will therefore pursue what is useful and good for them. Since what is it to command? It is being able to decide and impose what is best for oneself. But since they are the most numerous, they can no longer be the best, since the best are by definition fewer. Consequently, being the most numerous, they are not the best, and not being the best, they are the worst. So what those who are the worst seek will be good for whom? For the worst in the city. Now, what is bad for those who are bad in the city is also what is bad for the city. The author concludes that in such a city, speech must indeed be given to everyone, to the many, and so to the worst. Because, he says, what would happen if speech and deliberation were the exclusive privilege of decent, respectable people? If paresia was only granted to the best? Being granted paresia, the best would want to lay down the city's good, that is to say, their own good. And if they were to impose their own good, what is useful to them, this could only be to the advantage of these decent people and to the disadvantage of the people. Consequently, in a true democracy like Athens, if you want what is said to be for the advantage of the people and the many, the right to speak should not be reserved for the best. The bad, the author says, must be able to get up and speak. And then he will express what is good for him, the evil person, and for those like him. I am not going to dwell anymore on these, as you can see, somewhat sophistical arguments, but I think that these games are interesting and important. Because if their logic is obviously completely questionable, I think they put into practice, they apply some principles that it is important to see were commonly accepted in the 4th century form of the criticism of democracy as the place of paresia. Anyway, these few principles are found in much more serious forms of thought than this somewhat caricatural pamphlet. The underlying principles of this and many other texts can be summarized in the following way. And it seems to me that, in a sense, they have been a permanent matrix and challenge for political thought in the Western world. First, a principle which could be called the quantitative principle, or, if you like, the principle of opposition founded on a quantitative differentiation. The reasoning of the author of Politeia Atheniaeon, in fact, accepts as self-evident, and hundreds of other texts would show that people who are infinitely more serious than him reason in the same way and invoke the same opposition, that individuals in a city are distinguished from each other as falling into two major groups, characterized solely but fundamentally by the fact that one group contains more and the other less. On one side are the masses, on the other the few. It is this quantitative division between the hoi polloi and the few which basically organizes opposition in the city, the conflicts which may develop within it, and raises at the same time the problem of who should govern. So, quantitative opposition is the first principle, a principle of quantitative division of the city's unity. Second, this opposition, this quantitative division between the many and the others coincides with the opposition between the best and the worst. The quantitative division between the many and the others traces the same line as that of the ethical division between the good and the bad. This could be called, if you like, the principle of, forgive the barbaric expression, ethico-quantitative isomorphism. The third principle underlying this paradoxical text I have just cited is that this ethical distinction between the best and the less good corresponds to a political distinction. On one side, what is good for the best in the city is also what is good for the city. The good for the best is the city's good. Good for the worst is the city's evil. This could be called, if you like, the principle of political transitivity. The will of the best in seeking the good is useful to the city. The will of the worst in seeking their good is bad for the city. The consequence of this, and this is the fourth principle, is that the truth in the realm of political discourse, that is to say, what is good, useful, and healthy for the city, cannot be told in the form of democracy understood as the right for everyone to speak. The truth can be told in a city and political structure only when an essential quantitative division between the good and the bad is marked, maintained, and institutionalized. It is only to the extent that this essential ethical discrimination between the good and the bad has actually taken shape, found its place, and achieved definite manifestation within the political field that it will be possible for the truth to be told. And when the truth can be told, the city's good, that which is useful and healthy for it, will be able to take effect. In other words, there has to be truth for the city to exist and for it to be saved. But the truth can be told in a political field defined by an absence of differentiation between the subjects speaking. The truth can be told only in a political field marked and organized by a division between the more and less numerous, which is also the ethical division between those who are good and those who are bad, between the better and the worse. That is why truth-telling cannot have its place in the democratic game. Inasmuch as democracy is unable to recognize and cannot make room for ethical division on the basis of which, and only on the basis of which, truth-telling is possible. So, it would not be enough to say, as might be suggested by the first texts I cited, which take up those I referred to last year, that granting freedom of speech to everyone risks mixing up true and false, favoring flatterers, and exposing those who speak to personal dangers. All this is true, but it is only the effect of a more fundamental, structural impossibility. What is important to grasp in the type of analysis suggested by this paradoxical text is that by subjecting the better to the worse, by reversing the order of values, by installing this disorder, and by sustaining its absurdity, the very form of democracy cannot leave any place for truth-telling. It can only eliminate truth-telling by not listening to it when it is expressed, or by suppressing it physically with death. This enables us to understand what could be called very schematically, forgive me, I'm going to give a very rough overview, the Platonic reversal and the Aristotelian hesitation. First of all, the Platonic reversal. If indeed it is true that one cannot find parrhesia in democracy due to the fact that it lacks the ethical sense of discrimination which is indispensable for truth-telling, then, Plato will say, true discourse, when it is established through philosophy and in the form of philosophy, as the foundation of the politia, can only eliminate and banish democracy. We could say again, very schematically, that there is this great struggle between democracy and truth-telling. On the one hand, when we look at democratic institutions, we see that they cannot tolerate truth-telling and that they cannot fail to eliminate it. On the other hand, if we valorize truth-telling on the basis of the ethical choice characteristic of the philosopher and philosophy, then democracy cannot but be eliminated. Either democracy or truth-telling. After the criticism of democracy's inability to make room for truth-telling, the Platonic reversal consists in the validation of truth-telling as the defining principle of a politia, of a political structure, a constitution, a type of regime from which precisely democracy is carefully excluded. I refer you to what is stated in the Republic, Book 6. I have forgotten to provide you with the text, but you can read it yourselves. This is the passage I referred to earlier where Plato says, "Listen, to make myself understood, I will have to appeal to a comparison." A very classical, fundamental comparison, which is a matrix in all Greek political thought. We should think of the city like a boat, a ship, with a pilot who is a good man of good will, but a bit blind and unable to see beyond the end of his nose. This pilot is, of course, the people. And around him are the members of the crew who try to do only one thing: seize the helm and steer the ship in their interest. These are the demagogues. In order to take control of the helm, they flatter the pilot, seize the helm, and then, of course, steer, not according to any science of piloting or of the sea or sky, but according to their own interests. Democracy cannot appeal to true discourse. Contrasted with this will be the famous philosopher's descent back down into the cave. In Book 7, when, after having actually contemplated the truth, they are told, whatever pleasure you have felt in contemplating this truth, and even though you have recognized it as your homeland, you know very well that you must go back down into the city and become those who govern. You will impose your true discourse on all those who wish to govern the city according to the principles of flattery. After the criticism of democratic parrhesia, which shows that in the democracy there cannot be parrhesia in the sense of courageous truth-telling, the Platonic reversal shows, therefore, that good government, a good politia, must be founded on a true discourse, which will exclude democracy and demagogues. All this is well known, but I would like to dwell a bit more on what could be called the Aristotelian hesitation, which, notwithstanding Aristotle's much more democratic, in 1,000 quotation marks, sentiments, is based on the same problematic, the same difficulty in admitting the existence of parrhesia, of truth-telling in democratic institutions when democracy cannot make room for the ethical differentiation of speaking, deliberating, and decision-making subjects. Of course, Aristotle considerably developed, modified, transformed, and up to a point, refuted the schematic and crude principles which I have just referred to. The principle, for example, that the city is divided into two opposing groups, the many and the few. Aristotle asserts this principle, but at the same time he supplements it, modifies it, and questions it by bringing into play another form of opposition, the opposition between the rich and the poor. In a very interesting chapter in Book 3 of Biopolitics, he puts the question, does the opposition between the many and the few correspond exactly to that between the poor and the rich? For example, can we not envisage, and he considers it as a real possibility, a city in which the rich would be the many and the poor would be the few? In this case, assuming that power is given to the poor, that is to say, the few, could we speak of a democracy? In other words, if we define democracy as a constitution in which power is given to the many, would there be democracy if the rich were the many? And if the poor are the few, can their power be called democracy? Or should it be called an aristocracy? And in an extremely interesting and fundamental answer, which to an extent might have shifted the whole basis of Greek political thought, Aristotle says, it is the power of the poor which characterizes democracy, and even if there were a much smaller number of poor than rich, it would be enough that they exercise power for there to be a democracy. You can see that he hesitates here, and as it were, puts the rich-poor opposition to work on the many-few opposition, which was the fundamental, general, and relatively little developed framework found in other texts. Second, Aristotle also questions the other principle I have just referred to, according to which the many are the least good, and the few are necessarily the best. This coincidence between the best least good opposition and the few many opposition, this ethical quantitative isomorphism, is again questioned and put in doubt by Aristotle. He does this again in Book 3 of the Politics, where he says, "But after all, what is the best? Should we not distinguish between the virtue of the citizen and the virtue of the good man? Is there not a specifically political virtue which means that the individual will not only be a good citizen who, of course, fulfills his duties as such, but also someone who really seeks the interest of the city and takes decisions which are for the good of the city? He will be a good citizen, therefore, and yet he may not necessarily be a virtuous man, in the sense that we say a good man is generally virtuous in every aspect of his life and conduct. May it not be that one can be a good citizen without actually being a good man? Aristotle gives a complex rather than a simple answer. He distinguishes this relationship between the two virtues in the case of someone who is simply one of the governed, and in the case of someone who governs. I don't want to go into all these details, but you can see how, here again, Aristotle cannot purely and simply accept, naively and crudely, this superimposition of the distinctions between the many and the few, and between the worst and the best, which was accepted and fundamental for so long. He challenges this ethical quantitative isomorphism. Finally, third, Aristotle also questions what I have called the principle of political reversibility. That is to say, by pursuing their own interest, the best seek and find the city's interest, and by pursuing their own interest, the worst aim at and achieve, because they are the worst, what is harmful for the city. Again, in Book 3 of the Politics, Aristotle questions this principle by asserting that there may well be two basic orientations in every type of government, be it a monarchy, an aristocracy, or the government of all. There may be a monarchy in which, naturally, only one person commands, and this monarchy may have two forms. The monarch may well govern alone, pursuing his own rather than the city's interest. Or alternatively, he may govern by himself, but basically, first and foremost, having the city's interest as the objective. The same goes for government by an aristocracy, whose objective may be its own or the city's interest. And the same goes for the government of all, or the greatest number. That is to say, Aristotle does not accept the principle that government by the few can only be government by the best, or that government by the best in the interest of the best will mean government in the interest of the city. Rather, he posits as a principle that, whatever the form of government, those who govern may do so either in their own or in the city's interest. You see, then, that Aristotle challenges, questions, and works on these three principles that we saw at work, implicitly accepted and roughly worked out in the pseudo-Xenophon text. Granted this, ever so we have to remark that if, unlike Plato, Aristotle by no means concludes that a city should be founded only on true discourse, and that such a city, precisely inasmuch as it is established by true discourse, cannot be a democracy. With regard to the relations between true discourse and democracy, his position is still neither very clear nor, above all, very conclusive. To start with, I would like you to consider, first of all, this passage from, again, Book 3 of the Politics. Which is a famous passage on which commentators have dwelt for a long time without coming to a final solution. The more so as the reliability of the text itself is uncertain. Anyway, the passage is concerned with naming the different forms of government. And Aristotle contrasts or distinguishes monarchy and what we translate as kingship. Kingship is a monarchical type of government which considers the common interest. So we have this regime called kingship, in which the objective of the one who governs is not his own, but the city's interest. Second, he says, we may call a government aristocracy when it is a form of government by a few, but in which these few have the good of the city and all its members in view. As for the third form of government, in which it is the greatest number who govern, well, he says, it is very difficult to give it a name. And I can only call it by the general name of politia. Why is there no specific name for that form of government in which the many govern and where they pursue the city's interest rather than their own, than that of the greatest number? Aristotle explains by saying that if it is possible for one individual or even a small number of individuals to surpass the rest in virtue, it is very difficult for a large number of men to attain perfection in every kind of virtue. This is an enigmatic text which can only be understood, I think, in the following way. If there are, in fact, two formal possibilities for the three types of government, if it is true that, in a monarchy, the monarch may be interested in either his own or the city's advantage, if there may be a form of aristocracy that pursues the interests of the aristocrats and the few, or the interests of the city, on the other hand, when we come to the form of democracy in which the multitude rule, can we really expect this multitude to pursue anything other than its own interest? The text appears to say this. In the first two cases, we may concede that a king or a few may pursue the city's interest rather than their own. Why is this conceivable? Well, he says, because it is possible for a single individual or a small number of individuals to excel in virtue. So it is their ethical choice, their ethical differentiation from the others, which will make possible and ensure that government will be for all the others. On the other hand, he says, it is very difficult for a greater number of men to attain perfection in every kind of virtue, which means that when we turn to a mass of people, even if this mass governs the city, it is impossible or very difficult to find in that ethical differentiation, division, and singularity on the basis of which truth-telling will be possible, and the city's interests recognized through this truth-telling. Consequently, there cannot be a specific name for the type of democratic regime which would not be oriented toward the interest of the greater number, but toward the interest of the city itself. It has no name because, in all likelihood, it has no concrete existence. There is an enigmatic text which seems to suggest that a democracy in which the interest of everyone would be in command is formal possibility. If we follow Aristotle's general schema, but it does not and cannot really exist because there is no ethical differentiation in a democracy. Certainly, you can see that this is not exactly the structural impossibility defined a moment ago on the basis of the pseudo-Xenophon text, but it is nevertheless an inevitable impossibility. You can also find, still in Book 3 of the Politics, a discussion of this problem of ethical excellence, differentiation, and division. In short, the problem of the best in democracy, with, as a result, the problem of whether there is a place and status for the best, for ethical differentiation within democratic institutions, and the very way in which Aristotle poses the problem, envisages the difficulties, and carefully analyzes them, takes place on the basis of a democracy that is not so much defined as the power of the many over the others, as by the principle of alternation. A democratic politia is a constitution in which the governed always have the possibility of becoming governors. The problem Aristotle poses is how ethical differentiation is possible given this principle of the rotation and alternation of governed/governors. And here I would just like to point out to you the very interesting passage, which is only one of the examples of the difficulties which Aristotle himself raises about his own line of argument concerning ostracism, an utterly remarkable chapter. Ostracism is the measure available to the Athenian city which permits the people to exile an individual, not so much because of an offense or crime he may have committed, but solely because his prestige, his excellence, and the personal qualities of which he has given proof raise him too far above other citizens. This measure of ostracism, of which a number of famous Athenians of high merit were the victims, honorable men, but victims nevertheless, clearly raised a lot of problems. It was quite difficult to justify ostracism, and Aristotle raises the question: is ostracism, that is to say, the decision which enables the people to get rid of someone simply because he stands out rather than too much above the others, a justifiable measure? He answers the question and says, of course, there are many objections to ostracism, and yet it is justifiable. It is justifiable not only against ambitious citizens, whose superiority gives them the chance, the temptation, and the desire to exercise single absolute tyrannical power, but also against citizens who, because of some qualities, would stand out above the others. Why does Aristotle justify ostracism of citizens who, because of some qualities, would stand out above the others? It is basically because the city should be likened to a picture or a statue. We know very well that there may be a completely perfect detail in a picture. The painter has managed to render perfectly a hand, a finger, a toe, or an ear, which are little masterpieces of painting or sculpture. Nevertheless, it may still be that this detail is too much in the picture, and for the sake of the picture's beauty, perfection, and balance, the painter may be led to suppress this detail, however excellent it may be in itself. The same goes for the city, for reasons at once of perfection of form, aesthetics, and political balance. One may have to part with a citizen who would too clearly stand out above the others through certain of his qualities. But immediately after these considerations, at the end of the chapter on ostracism, he adds, if someone is particularly exceptional through his virtue in the city, is it just to exile him? Is it even just to want to subject him to the common rule? An exceptional man, someone wholly exceptional for his virtue, should not be exiled or even subjected to the common rule. Concerning this man, he says, the only alternative is to adopt the solution which is in accordance with the nature of things. What is this solution? In accordance with the nature of things, it is that everyone, every citizen should willingly obey such a man, so that those like him are ever kings in their cities. You can see how, after all this discussion of the question of founding democracy, on the principle of the rotation and alternation of governors and governed, in which Aristotle runs up against this very difficult, paradoxical problem, this real political challenge constituted by ostracism, after having said that ultimately ostracism can be justified here in the case of a particularly marked ethical difference in which certain individuals would truly surpass all the others in their ethical value, asking himself what place these individuals can be given in a democratic city. Aristotle answers, we cannot apply ostracism to them. We cannot even apply to them the laws which are valid for everyone else. Even more, we have to submit to them, to obey them, and give them a place, and a place which really, in its formulation, has Platonic echoes, since it involves giving the place of king in the city to those men who are wiser than others. The kingship of virtue, the monarchy of virtue, finds its place and asserts itself as soon as democracy tries to raise the question of moral excellence. In short, when, with Aristotle, an attempt is made to give the best possible justification for the laws and rules of democracy, we see that democracy can give only one place to moral excellence, a place which itself embodies the refusal of democracy. If there really is someone virtuous, let democracy disappear, and let men obey this man of virtue, this man of ethical excellence, like a king. These are just a few moments in the history of what could be called, somewhat pretentiously, the crisis of democratic parousia in Greek thought of the 4th century. You see that straight away this has brought us up against the problem of ethos and ethical differentiation. I will stop there, if you like, for 5 minutes. We will start again shortly, and I will then try to show you the other aspect of the elaboration of this problem of parousia in 4th century Greek thought. Okay, that's the end of the first hour of lecture 2 of the Courage of the Truth lectures by Michel Foucault.